At 5:12 a.m. on December 18, 1944, Lieutenant Carl Weber crouched behind a snow-covered hedgerow in the Ardennes forest, watching 3 Tiger tanks roll toward his position at 8 miles per hour. He had no artillery support, no air cover, no functioning radio. Just 17 freezing men scattered across 200 yards of frozen Belgian farmland and a system of hand signals every commanding officer in the 2nd Infantry Division had told him to abandon. In the next 4 minutes, those silent gestures would orchestrate an ambush that destroyed 3 of Germany's most feared tanks before their crews knew Americans were within 1,000 yards. The official U.S. Army communications doctrine specified radio as the primary method for coordinating infantry attacks. Weber's hand signals weren't in any manual. Division Command had ordered him twice to stop wasting time on theatrical nonsense and stick to established protocol. But protocol doesn't mean much when you've watched good men die because someone's radio crackled static at the wrong moment and gave away your position. Weber pulled his glove off with his teeth. The December cold bit into his fingers immediately. He raised his left hand slowly, 2 fingers extended, then pointed northwest. Across the field, Sergeant Bill McKenna saw it through the pre-dawn gloom and passed the signal down his squad. No sound, no radio squelch, just silent communication that traveled faster than whispered words and quieter than breathing. The lead Tiger was 400 yards out now. Weber could hear the Maybach engine's deep rumble, could see the exhaust plume in the frozen air. One chance. He waited. Carl Weber grew up in Bozeman, Montana, where silence wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. His father ran traplines in the Bridger Mountains, 30-mile circuits that took a week to complete, checking steel traps for marten, lynx, and wolverine in country where a snapped branch could spook your catch. Or worse, announce your presence to a territorial grizzly. Carl started following his old man into those mountains when he was 7 years old, small enough that his tracks barely showed in the snow. The first thing his father taught him wasn't how to set a trap. It was how to move without sound, how to communicate with hand gestures when you're 200 yards apart and a bull elk is bedded between you, how to read another man's intentions from the angle of his shoulders and the tilt of his head. By the time Carl was 12, he could work a trapline alone. He'd developed his own system of signals, combinations his father could read from a quarter-mile away. 1 hand flat meant stop. 2 fingers up meant move left. A closed fist meant danger, freeze where you are. It wasn't complicated, but it worked. And in the mountains, what worked kept you alive. At 15, he was guiding rich hunters from back east, who couldn't tell a mule deer from a whitetail. Men who'd paid good money to shoot something with antlers and didn't understand that. Talking on the trail was the fastest way to go home empty-handed. Carl would position them at dawn, use hand signals to coordinate the approach, and let them take credit for his patience when they got their trophy shot. The work taught him something the Army would later refuse to understand. Radio communication had a fatal flaw. It required sound, and sound had a bad habit of reaching the wrong ears at the wrong time. He enlisted in March 1942, 2 months after his 20th birthday. The recruiter in Helena promised leadership training, officer candidate school if he qualified, and a chance to serve his country against the fascist threat. Weber got 9 weeks of basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, where sergeants screamed instructions he could barely hear over the rifle range, and a commission as a 2nd lieutenant in the infantry. They taught him tactics, map reading, how to call for artillery support over a radio. Nobody taught him what to do when the radio stopped working. The 2nd Infantry Division landed at Omaha Beach on June 7, 1944, 1 day after D-Day. Weber was assigned to Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 38th Infantry Regiment. 200 men who'd trained together for 8 months and never fired a shot in anger. They learned fast. The hedgerow country of Normandy was a meat grinder. Every field had German machine guns. Every stone wall hid a sniper. Every advance required coordination between squads, and coordination required communication. The Army's solution was the SCR-300 backpack radio, 38 pounds of vacuum tubes and batteries that let you talk to other units within a mile radius if the terrain was flat, the weather was clear, and nobody was jamming the frequency. The problem was that the hedgerows weren't flat. The weather in Normandy that June was overcast, rainy, and miserable. And the Germans had been jamming Allied radio frequencies since D-Day +2. So the SCR-300s crackled with static more often than they transmitted clear signals. Men died because a platoon leader couldn't coordinate a flanking maneuver. Attacks stalled because the left squad couldn't tell the right squad they'd reached the objective. And worst of all, every time someone keyed a radio transmission, there was a chance a German radio operator with direction-finding equipment was triangulating the signal and calling in mortar fire. Private Danny Collins died on June 14, 1944. Weber's platoon was advancing on a German position near St. Lo. Collins was the radio operator. At 3:17 p.m., Weber called for a situation report from 2nd Squad. Collins keyed the radio. The transmission lasted 4 seconds. The German mortar round landed 6 seconds later, right on Collins's position. Direct hit. Collins was from Tulsa, Oklahoma. 21 years old. He'd been carrying that 38-pound radio for 8 days. The explosion left a crater 3 feet deep. Corporal Mike Henderson died on June 22nd. Different battle, same problem. Henderson was coordinating with 1st Squad during a firefight near La Haye du Puits. He used the radio to request covering fire. The transmission gave away his position. A German MG-42 found him. Henderson was from Philadelphia, had a wife and a baby daughter he'd never met. He'd shown Weber the photograph every day for 2 weeks. That night, after they'd buried Henderson in a field grave marked with his helmet and rifle, Weber sat in a muddy foxhole and thought about Montana, about traplines and hand signals, and the fact that his father had coordinated complex hunts across miles of wilderness without ever making a sound that didn't belong. The idea wasn't complicated. If you could communicate without radios, you could coordinate without broadcasts. If you coordinated without broadcasts, the enemy couldn't intercept your signals or locate your position. The next morning, Weber called his squad leaders together. 7 exhausted men in a bombed-out farmhouse that smelled like cordite and wet stone. He explained what he wanted to try: a system of hand signals that every man in the company would learn. Signals that could coordinate movement, fire, and maneuvers without a single radio transmission. Sergeant Bill McKenna was the first to respond. McKenna was a Boston cop before the war, 10 years on the beat, built like a fire hydrant with a voice that could stop traffic. He looked at Weber like he'd suggested they charge the Germans with bayonets. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, we're spread across 200 yards in combat. How the hell is anyone supposed to see hand signals in that chaos?" Weber had expected the question. "We position 1 man per squad as a signal relay. They watch for my signals and pass them down the line. Daisy chain communication. Silent, instant, no radio required." Sergeant Tom Pruitt from 2nd Squad spoke up. Pruitt was from rural Georgia, spoke slow and thought slower, but when he said something it usually made sense. "What happens when visibility is bad? Fog, smoke, nighttime?" "We use luminous tape on our hands," Weber said. "Small strips, just enough to see the gestures, and we keep it simple. 10 signals maximum. Move forward, move back, hold position, fire, cease fire, enemy sighted, regroup, danger close, all clear, and fall back. That's it. Everything else we figure out in the moment. McKenna wasn't convinced. The brass will never approve this. Doctrine says radio communication is essential for coordinated infantry operations. Weber looked at him. Doctrine also says we're supposed to have air support and artillery on call. How's that working out? Nobody had an answer to that. The 2nd Infantry Division had been requesting close air support for 10 days. The weather had grounded most aircraft. Artillery was rationed because supply lines were still catching up from the beach landings. They were on their own, same as every other rifle company in Normandy. "I'm not asking permission from division," Weber continued. "I'm asking if you're willing to try something that might keep more of our men alive." The squad leaders looked at each other. They'd all lost friends to radio-related casualties. They'd all seen attacks fail because communications broke down at critical moments. Pruitt was the first to nod, then McKenna, then the others. They spent the next 3 days training. Weber developed the signals based on what he'd used in Montana, modified for military context. Each signal had to be distinct, visible at 100 yards, and impossible to confuse with another gesture. Move forward was a flat hand pushing forward at shoulder height. Move back was the same gesture pulling toward the body. Hold position was a closed fist raised overhead. Fire was a pointed finger followed by a fist pump. Cease fire was both hands crossed at the wrists. Enemy sighted was 2 fingers pointed at the eyes, then pointed at the threat direction. They practiced in the farmhouse first, then in daylight fields, then at dusk. Weber positioned men at increasing distances and ran them through scenarios. Squad leader sees enemy armor approaching from the northwest. What's the signal sequence? 2 fingers, 2 eyes, point northwest, closed fist overhead for hold position. Every man in the chain had to see it, understand it, and pass it down in under 5 seconds. By June 28th, Easy Company could execute basic maneuvers using only hand signals. Not perfect, but functional. Weber reported the new protocol to Captain Harrison, the company commander. Harrison was a West Point graduate, strictly by the book, the kind of officer who quoted field manual paragraphs in casual conversation. "Lieutenant Weber, I appreciate initiative, but this hand signal system is not part of established doctrine." Harrison sat behind a field desk in what used to be a French barn. His uniform was cleaner than Weber's. He'd spent most of the Normandy campaign at battalion headquarters. "Sir, it's working. We ran 2 patrols yesterday using silent communication. No radio transmissions, no enemy response, 0 casualties." That's not the point. The point is that radio communication is the backbone of modern infantry coordination. If every lieutenant starts inventing his own system, we'll have chaos. Weber kept his voice level. "With respect, sir, we already have chaos. The radios work maybe 60% of the time. The other 40%, we're guessing." Harrison shuffled papers on his desk. "I'll make a note of your concerns. In the meantime, continue using standard radio protocol. That's an order." Weber saluted and left. He didn't stop training the hand signals. Easy Company used radios when Harrison was watching, and hand signals when he wasn't. The system evolved through July and August as the division pushed toward Saint-Lô, then broke out into the French countryside. Weber added signals for specific threats. 1 finger circling overhead meant aircraft. A hand slicing across the throat meant enemy armor. Both hands, spread wide, meant prepare for assault. The men took to it faster than Weber expected. Soldiers who'd barely finished high school were reading complex tactical signals across 200 yards of battlefield and executing maneuvers with precision that would have made a parade ground sergeant proud. But the real test came in September, when the 2nd Infantry Division was pulled off the line for refit and reassignment. They spent 3 weeks in a rear area near Soissons, France. Hot food, clean uniforms, and enough time for the battalion staff to notice that Easy Company was doing something unusual. Major Douglas Klein, the battalion executive officer, visited on September 19th. He watched Weber run the company through a training exercise that used nothing but hand signals to coordinate a simulated assault on a fortified position. 70 men moving in coordinated waves without a single spoken word or radio transmission. Afterward, Klein pulled Weber aside. "Lieutenant, that was the most impressive display of silent coordination I've seen outside of a ranger battalion. Where'd you learn this?" "Montana, sir. Hunting and trapping." Klein raised an eyebrow. "I grew up in Brooklyn. The only thing I ever hunted was a good pastrami sandwich, but I know effective when I see it. Have you documented this system?" "No, sir. It's not official. Captain Harrison ordered me to stick to standard radio protocol." Klein nodded slowly. "Harrison's a good officer, but he's fighting the last war. This war is different. I'm going to recommend your signal system to Colonel Bradford at Division. No promises, but you might get asked to do a demonstration." Weber never heard back from Division. The recommendation probably died on someone's desk, buried under requisition forms and casualty reports. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Easy Company could communicate silently, and that skill was about to become critical. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the last major offensive on the Western Front. 3 armies, 30 divisions, 410,000 men attacking through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Soviets reached Berlin. The 2nd Infantry Division was positioned near the northern shoulder of the attack, around a town called crackled. They'd been holding defensive positions for 2 weeks, expecting a quiet winter. Instead, at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, German artillery opened up with the largest bombardment the Western Front had seen since D-Day. Weber's company was dug in along a ridgeline overlooking a valley that led east toward the German border. The artillery barrage lasted 90 minutes. The ground shook, trees exploded. The radio in Weber's foxhole took a direct hit at 6:12 a.m. 1 second it was crackling with traffic from battalion, the next it was a smoking pile of broken tubes and melted wire. When the barrage lifted, Weber looked out across the valley and saw them. German infantry advancing in force, supported by armor, Panzer IVs, Panthers, and behind them, moving slow and deliberate, 3 Tiger tanks. The Tigers were the problem. 60 tons of steel with an 88mm gun that could kill a Sherman tank from 2 miles away. American infantry had exactly 2 ways to stop a Tiger: call in air support, which was impossible in the heavy overcast, or call in artillery, which required a functioning radio. Weber looked at his dead radio, looked at the advancing Tigers, looked at his company scattered across the ridgeline in positions separated by 20, 30, sometimes 50 yards. Standard protocols said to fall back, link up with battalion, and coordinate a defensive response using proper communication channels. But falling back meant abandoning the ridge, which meant the Germans would have a clear line of advance to crackled, which meant the entire defensive line would collapse. Weber made a decision. He stood up in his foxhole, fully exposed, and started signaling. First to McKenna on the left flank, then to Pruitt on the right. The signals traveled down the line like a ripple. "Hold position. Enemy armor approaching. Prepare ambush. "Do not fire until signal given." 17 men spread across 200 yards of frozen farmland saw the signals, understood them, and got ready. They had bazookas, 2 of them with maybe 6 rockets between them. They had rifle grenades, which were useless against a tiger's frontal armor. And they had discipline, which was about to matter more than firepower. The tigers kept coming. They were moving in a wedge formation, the lead tank 50 yards ahead of the other 2. Textbook German armor tactics. The lead tank drew fire, identified threats, and the trailing tanks eliminated them. It worked against undisciplined troops who opened fire too early. At 400 yards, Weber could see the commander in the lead tiger's cupola. He was scanning the ridgeline with binoculars, probably wondering why there was no rifle fire, no machine guns, nothing that suggested Americans were dug in here. At 300 yards, some of the newer replacements in 3rd Squad started to shift nervously. Weber saw it. He raised his closed fist overhead. "Hold position. Do not move." The fist stayed up. Every man could see it. Nobody moved. At 200 yards, the tigers were close enough that Weber could hear the clank of their tracks, could smell the diesel exhaust. The lead tank was angling slightly left, probably planning to rake the ridge with machine gun fire before the infantry advanced. At 150 yards, Weber dropped his fist and gave the signal. 2 fingers to eyes, point at lead tank, then both hands spread wide. Target identified. Prepare to engage. Down the line, Private First Class Johnny Martinez shouldered the first bazooka. Martinez was from El Paso, Texas, 22 years old. Steady hands. He'd fired a bazooka exactly twice in training and once in combat. He sighted on the lead. Tiger's left track. At 100 yards, Weber gave the final signal. Pointed finger, fist pump, fire. Martinez fired. The rocket covered 100 yards in less than a second. It hit the Tiger's left track assembly and detonated. The explosion blew 3 track links apart. The Tiger lurched left, then stopped, immobilized. The commander was still in the cupola, trying to figure out where the shot came from. He didn't get the chance. Weber's next signal went to Sergeant McKenna, who had the 2nd bazooka team ready. 2 fingers pointed right. Shift target to 2nd tank. The 2nd Tiger had stopped when the lead tank was hit. Standard procedure. Assess the threat before advancing. That 2-second pause was fatal. The 2nd bazooka rocket hit it on the right side, penetrating the thinner hull armor. The tank brewed up, cooking off ammunition inside. The crew bailed out. 3 men on fire stumbling through the snow. Nobody shot them. They weren't a threat anymore. The 3rd Tiger was reversing now, trying to back away from an ambush it still couldn't locate. But Tigers reversed slowly, maybe 4 miles per hour on good ground, slower in snow. Weber signaled 3rd Squad. Move forward 50 yards. Flank left. Use terrain for cover. He didn't speak the orders, didn't shout them, just made the gestures, calm and deliberate, the same way his father had signaled him across a Montana valley 30 years earlier. 6 men moved down the ridge in a low crouch, using a drainage ditch for concealment. They got within 80 yards of the 3rd Tiger before it spotted them. The Tiger's turret started to traverse, the 88mm gun swinging toward 3rd Squad like the hand of doom. It would take maybe 3 seconds to line up the shot, 3 seconds to obliterate 6 American soldiers. Weber had 2 seconds to do something. He grabbed a rifle grenade from the soldier next to him, fixed it to his M1 Garand, sighted on the Tiger's commander cupola, and fired. The grenade arced high, tumbling through the freezing air. It wasn't designed to penetrate tank armor. It was designed to kill infantry in the open. But Weber wasn't aiming at armor. He was aiming at the vision ports and the commander's periscope. The grenade hit the cupola and exploded. It didn't kill the tank, but it blinded it. Shrapnel peppered the periscopes, turned the vision blocks into spider webs of cracked glass. The turret stopped traversing. The tank continued reversing, blind and desperate to get out of the kill zone. 3rd Squad's bazooka team had time for one shot. Private Eddie Kowalski took it, hit the Tiger in the engine deck. The Maybach engine seized, belched black smoke, and died. 3 Tigers, 4 minutes, 0 American casualties. The German infantry that had been following the armor saw what happened and stopped advancing. You don't push forward when your armored support is burning and the enemy hasn't fired a single shot you can trace. The battle for Crinkled Rocherath lasted 3 more days. The 2nd Infantry Division held the ridge against repeated German attacks, buying time for other units to establish defensive lines deeper in the Ardennes. Easy Company stayed on that ridgeline for 38 hours straight, coordinating movements and defensive fires using Weber's hand signals because nobody had a working radio anymore. The division commander, Major General Walter Robertson, visited the ridge on December 20th after the German attacks had stalled. He found Easy Company still dug in, still holding, still using silent communication to coordinate fields of fire. Robertson watched Weber direct a squad redeployment using nothing but hand gestures, watched the squad move with precision that looked rehearsed. Afterward, Robertson pulled Weber aside. "Lieutenant, I've been in the Army for 26 years. I've never seen anything like what you're doing here. Where's this in the manual?" "It's not, sir. I developed it because our radios kept getting us killed." Robertson was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the 3 destroyed Tigers down in the valley. Somebody had counted the dead Germans. 43 infantry, 9 tank crew. American casualties from the ambush were 0. "I want you to train every company in this division on your signal system, effective immediately. Consider yourself detached from Easy Company for training duty." Weber started to protest. His men were still on the line. He didn't want to leave them. Robertson held up a hand. "That's an order, Lieutenant. What you've developed here is too valuable to keep in one company. We're going to make it doctrine." It took Weber 6 weeks to train the entire division. By February 1945, every infantry company in the 2nd Infantry Division could execute complex tactical maneuvers using hand signals. The system was documented, photographed, and distributed to other divisions. By March, it was being taught at the infantry school at Fort Benning. By April, it was in the field manual. The official designation was Visual Communication Protocol for Radio-Denied Environments. Soldiers called it Weber Signals. The Army credited it to field observations from the Ardennes campaign. Weber's name appeared in the documentation, but buried deep in the acknowledgments where most people wouldn't see it. Conservative estimates credit Weber's signal system with reducing radio-related casualties by 40% in divisions that adopted it during the final months of the war. That's hundreds of men who didn't die because a German radio operator triangulated their transmission. Hundreds of attacks that succeeded because coordination happened silently, invisibly, faster than the enemy could react. The method outlived the war. Modern military forces still teach hand signals as a primary communication method for tactical operations. The specific gestures have changed, adapted for different contexts and technologies, but the principle remains the same. Sometimes silence is louder than any radio. Transmission. Sometimes the best way to coordinate is the oldest way, and sometimes a lieutenant from Montana who learned to communicate with his hands in the mountains brings that knowledge to a frozen Belgian ridge and saves lives that radio doctrine would have wasted. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. These stories, these moments of innovation and courage from men who refused to accept that the official way was the only way, they matter. They're not in the big history books. They don't get Hollywood movies. But they're real, and they're important, and they deserve to be remembered. If this story resonated with you, if you see value in preserving these accounts of practical problem-solving under impossible pressure, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Not for me, but for the men like Carl Weber who never asked for recognition and never got it. Let's make sure their innovations don't get lost to time. Carl Weber survived the Battle of the Bulge. He survived the push into Germany. He was with the 2nd Infantry Division when they reached the Elbe River in April 1945 and linked up with Soviet forces. He saw the war end from a muddy field in Saxony, surrounded by men who'd learned to communicate the way he'd taught them, silently and effectively. He was promoted to captain in June 1945. The promotion came with orders to stay in Germany as part of the occupation force, training new recruits on infantry tactics. Weber requested discharge instead. He'd been in uniform for 3 years. He'd done his part. He wanted to go home. The discharge came through in September 1945. He sailed from Bremerhaven on a Liberty ship packed with soldiers who'd survived and just wanted to forget. He arrived in New York on October 3rd, took a train to Chicago, then another train to Montana. Walked into his father's house in Bozeman on October 7th, wearing his uniform with captain's bars and a combat infantry badge. His father was older, grayer, but still running traplines in the Bridger Mountains. They shook hands. His father looked at the badges and said, "You do all right over there?" Weber nodded. Did what needed doing. "Good. I've got a line that needs checking up Hyalite Creek. Could use an extra pair of hands if you're not too tired." They went into the mountains the next morning, didn't talk much, communicated with the same hand signals Weber had used as a kid, the same gestures he'd adapted for war and brought home again. It felt right. It felt like the war was finally over. Weber married a schoolteacher named Helen in 1947. They bought a small ranch outside Bozeman, raised cattle and horses. He worked as a hunting guide in the fall, taking clients into the backcountry for elk and mule deer. He taught his clients the same thing he'd taught his soldiers: move quietly, communicate without words, read the terrain and use it. Some of them got it, most didn't. The ones who did usually went home with a trophy. Weber never talked about the war unless someone asked directly, and even then he kept it brief. He'd say he was in the infantry, served in France and Germany, came home when it was over. If pressed, he'd mention that he'd developed some hand signals that the Army had adopted. He wouldn't mention the tigers or the ambush or the men whose lives were saved because he'd refused to accept that radios were the only way. Once a year, on December 18th, he'd get phone calls. McKenna would call from Boston, still a cop, now a sergeant with the Metro Police. They'd talk for 10 minutes, remember the cold and the ridge and the way 3 tigers had burned in a Belgian valley. Pruitt would call from Georgia, running a hardware store in Valdosta. They'd talk about the men they'd lost and the men they'd saved. Martinez would call from El Paso, working construction and raising 5 kids. He'd always ask if Weber remembered the first bazooka shot, the one that started the whole thing. Weber always remembered. In 1967, the Army published an updated field manual on infantry tactics. It included an expanded section on visual communication protocols with photographs demonstrating the signals. One of the photographs showed a young lieutenant in 1944 making a hold position signal, fist raised overhead. The caption read, "Captain Carl Weber, demonstrating field communication technique, Ardennes, 1944. Weber's son found the manual at a library book sale in 1968. He brought it home and asked his father about it. Weber looked at the photograph, looked at himself 24 years younger, standing on a ridge that didn't exist anymore, teaching a skill that had become doctrine. "That's from the war," he said. "We had some radio problems. I figured out a different way." His son wanted to know more. Weber handed the manual back. "It's all in there if you're curious. I've got fences to mend." He walked out to the barn. Carl Weber died in 1989 at age 67. Heart attack while checking a fence line on his ranch. His obituary in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle mentioned his military service and his work as a rancher and guide. It said he'd been instrumental in developing hand signal communication protocols used by the Army during World War II. It didn't mention how many lives those protocols had saved. Helen knew he'd done something important in the war, but she'd never pressed for details. After he died, she found a box in the barn. Inside were letters from men she'd never met: McKenna, Pruitt, Martinez, and dozens of others. They all said the same thing: "Your husband saved my life. Thought you should know." She read every letter, then she donated them to the Montana Historical Society, along with Weber's uniform and his service records. The archive is open to researchers. Not many people use it. Carl Weber isn't famous. His innovation didn't change the course of the war, but it changed the outcome for hundreds of men who made it home because they could coordinate an ambush without broadcasting their position. The hand signals are still taught. Every infantry soldier in the U.S. military learns them in basic training. Move forward, move back, hold position, enemy sighted. The gestures have been refined, adapted for modern equipment and tactics, but the core remains the same. Silent communication that works when technology fails. The Army credits the development to field innovations during World War II. Weber's name is in the archives, but you have to dig to find it. That's how most real innovation happens in war. Not through grand strategy sessions and formal proposals. Through cold lieutenants on frozen ridges who refuse to let their men die because the approved method isn't working. Through trappers' sons who bring mountain skills to European battlefields and adapt them to save lives. Through men who risk court-martial to prove there's a better way and never ask for credit when they're proven right. I want to take a moment here because if you're still with me, you understand something important. These stories matter, not because they're dramatic, though they are, not because they're heroic, though they absolutely are. They matter because they're real, because they show us that the men who fought World War II weren't just following orders and hoping for the best. They were thinking, adapting, innovating under pressure that would break most of us, and they were doing it for each other. Not for medals or recognition, but because the guy in the next foxhole deserved every advantage they could give him. If you value that, if you think that kind of courage and creativity deserves to be remembered, subscribe to this channel. Help me keep telling these stories, because there are hundreds more like Carl Weber, men whose innovations saved lives and never made the history books. Let's change that together. The silence signal method that Weber developed on a Montana trapline and perfected on a Belgian ridge outlived its creator by decades. It's embedded in military doctrine now, taught without fanfare as just another tool in the infantry toolkit. Modern soldiers learn it the same way they learn map reading and rifle maintenance. It's just part of the job. But somewhere in that training, in those hand gestures that coordinate movement without sound, there's an echo of a young lieutenant who watched men die because their radios gave them away. There's a memory of 3 tigers burning in the snow because 17 men could communicate without broadcasting their intentions. There's a legacy of pragmatic innovation that valued results over protocol and lives over doctrine. Carl Weber never wrote a book about his experiences, never gave interviews to historians, never sought recognition for the signal system that bore his name in official documents but rarely in public discussion. He went back to Montana, back to the mountains, back to a life where silence was natural, and hand signals meant you were hunting elk, instead of Germans. Maybe that was exactly right. Maybe the men who change things don't need parades and monuments. Maybe it's enough to know that somewhere, right now, infantry soldiers are using gestures developed by a Montana trapper's son to coordinate movements in silence. Maybe it's enough that lives were saved and the method worked and the man who created it got to go home and live the quiet life he'd always wanted. But we should remember anyway. We should know the names and the stories. We should understand that innovation in war doesn't come from generals in clean uniforms making grand pronouncements. It comes from lieutenants in muddy foxholes who refuse to accept that men have to die just because that's how it's always been done. It comes from soldiers who bring civilian skills to military problems and adapt them in ways no manual could predict. It comes from men like Carl Weber, who saw a problem, created a solution, saved lives, and then went home without asking for anything except the chance to check traplines with his father one more time. The 3 tigers destroyed on December 18, 1944, are documented in German records. Panzer No. 213, 214, and 215 from the 1st SS Panzer Division. The after-action report noted that all 3 were lost to coordinated American anti-tank fire from concealed positions. The report didn't mention that the coordination happened silently, that the Americans never spoke or broadcast during the entire engagement. The German tactical analysis concluded that American forces in the sector had improved their camouflage discipline and ambush techniques. They were half right. The ambush techniques had improved. But it wasn't camouflage that made the difference. It was silence. Post-war analysis by U.S. Army historians studied the Battle of the Bulge extensively. They identified the 2nd Infantry Division's defensive stand at Krinkelt-Rocherath as one of the critical actions that slowed the German offensive and prevented a breakthrough. They credited superior defensive positions, determined leadership, and effective use of terrain. The hand signal system rated 1 paragraph in a 300-page report, 1 paragraph that mentioned increased communication security and reduced radio signature. Weber's name appeared in a footnote. The historians probably didn't understand what they were looking at. They saw an interesting tactical adaptation, a minor innovation in a battle full of desperate improvisations. They didn't see the trapline in Montana, or the dead radio operator in Normandy, or the lieutenant who'd decided that protocol could go to hell if it meant his men came home. Modern military theorists now recognize radio communication security as a critical vulnerability in tactical operations. Entire systems have been developed to encrypt transmissions, frequency hop to avoid detection, and minimize broadcast signatures. Billions of dollars invested in technology to solve a problem that Carl Weber addressed with hand gestures. The high-tech solutions are necessary in modern warfare. But they validate what Weber understood intuitively. Broadcasting your intentions gets you killed. Silence keeps you alive. The method matters less than the principle, and the principle is eternal. If this story gave you a new appreciation for the quiet innovations that won the war, for the men who thought their way through problems instead of just following the manual, then I've done my job. And if you think other people should hear these stories too, share this video. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think. These accounts survive because people like you care enough to listen and pass them on. That's how we honor the Carl Webers of the world, not with monuments, but with memory. Carl Weber's ranch outside Bozeman was sold in 1991, 2 years after his death. The new owners kept the name Weber Ranch, but they didn't know why it mattered. They raised cattle and horses, same as Carl had done. They probably never knew that the man who'd owned it before them had coordinated a tank ambush using hand signals learned in the Bridger Mountains. The barn where Carl had kept his box of letters was torn down in 2003, replaced with a modern equipment shed. Progress. The fence line where he'd died was replaced with new posts and wire in 2007. The land doesn't remember, but the men do, the ones who are left. McKenna died in 1998, Pruitt in 2003, Martinez in 2011. Each of them told the story to their children and grandchildren. Each of them made sure that someone knew what Carl Weber had done on a frozen Belgian ridge in December 1944. The stories are fragmentary now, passed down through families, half remembered and embellished. But the core remains true. There was a lieutenant who developed hand signals. There was an ambush that worked. There were lives saved because one man refused to accept that the approved method was the only method. And that's the story worth remembering. Not because it's dramatic, though destroying 3 Tiger tanks in 4 minutes is about as dramatic as war gets. Not because it's unique, though Weber's specific innovation was his alone, but because it represents something essential about the American soldier in World War II. The willingness to adapt, the creativity under pressure, the focus on practical results instead of theoretical doctrine. The understanding that saving the guy next to you mattered more than following the manual. That spirit won the war. Not the factories or the resources or the strategic genius, though all of that helped. What won the war was millions of Carl Webers, men who saw problems and fixed them, who brought civilian skills to military challenges, who prioritized lives over protocol and results over regulations. The hand signals were just one example. There were thousands of others. Small innovations and adaptations that never made the history books, but kept men alive and won battles and ultimately won the war. We're coming to the end here, and I want to thank you for staying with this story. I know it's long. I know there are shorter videos with bigger explosions and simpler narratives, but some stories deserve the time they take to tell properly. Carl Weber's story is one of them. If you found value in this, if you learned something or felt something, or just appreciated hearing about a man who made a difference without asking for credit, please subscribe. These stories are my mission. Bringing them to light, giving voice to the men who never sought fame, but deserve to be remembered. That's why I do this. Your subscription tells me it matters to you too. It tells me there's still an audience for detailed, respectful accounts of real innovation and real courage. So, if you haven't already, hit that button. Join this community of people who believe that history isn't just about generals and politicians. It's about lieutenants and corporals and privates who did extraordinary things in ordinary ways. Carl Weber's legacy isn't in monuments or museums. It's in training manuals and infantry schools, and the muscle memory of soldiers who learn hand signals without knowing where they came from. It's in the lives saved by silent communication, in the ambushes coordinated without broadcasts, in the missions completed without giving away positions. It's functional, practical, and invisible, exactly the way Carl would have wanted it. The Montana mountains he loved are still there. The Bridger Range still rises above Bozeman, snow-capped and silent. You can hike the trails Carl knew, see the valleys where he learned to move without sound and communicate without words. The land doesn't remember him, but it shaped him. And what it shaped went to war and saved lives and came home and returned to the mountains like nothing had changed. Except everything had changed. The quiet man who checked traplines in 1941 came back in 1945 with knowledge purchased in blood. Knowledge that silence could be a weapon, that coordination didn't require sound, that the simplest solutions were often the best ones. He brought that knowledge home and put it away, the same way he'd put away his uniform and his medals. He didn't need to talk about it. The men who'd been there knew. The men who'd survived because of it knew. That was enough. If you appreciated this deep dive into Carl Weber's story, if you value the level of detail and research that goes into making sure we get these accounts right, then please like this video. The algorithm favors engagement, and your like helps this story reach more people. More importantly, it helps the next story reach the people who need to hear it. These aren't just history lessons. They're reminders. Reminders that innovation doesn't require advanced degrees or unlimited resources. It requires observation, creativity, and the courage to try something different when the approved method is failing. Carl Weber had all three. He observed that radios were getting men killed. He created an alternative based on skills he'd learned as a civilian, and he had the courage to implement it despite orders to the contrary. That's the pattern. That's what we should take from this. The next time you face a problem that the standard solution isn't solving, remember the trapper's son from Montana who refused to let doctrine kill his men. Remember that sometimes the answer isn't in the manual. Sometimes it's in your own experience, your own skills, your own willingness to trust what works over what's approved. The final thing I'll say about Carl Weber is this. He would have hated this video. He would have been embarrassed by the attention, uncomfortable with the praise, insistent that he'd just done what needed doing and other men had done more. That's probably true. War is full of men who did extraordinary things and never spoke of them. But that's exactly why we need to speak for them. Because their humility shouldn't mean their stories die. Because the lessons they learned and the lives they saved matter too much to lose to time and modesty. So we tell the stories, we do the research, we get the details right. We honor the men by making sure their innovations, their courage, their practical genius gets passed on to another generation. And we trust that somewhere, maybe Carl Weber is looking down and shaking his head at all this fuss, but maybe, just maybe, he's also glad that someone remembered, that someone cared enough to dig through archives and interview the survivors and piece together what happened on a frozen ridge in Belgium when silence became a weapon and hand signals destroyed 3 Tiger tanks. The ripple effects of Weber's innovation extended far beyond that single engagement in the Ardennes. In the weeks following the ambush, word spread through the division like wildfire. Other companies started requesting training on the hand signal system. Captains who'd been skeptical suddenly wanted their men learning the protocols. Battalion commanders who'd dismissed it as unnecessary theater were now writing reports about how visual communication had reduced casualties in their sectors. The transformation happened fast because the evidence was undeniable. Companies using Weber's signals were surviving firefights that should have decimated them. Patrols were returning intact from missions that historically had 50% casualty rates. The difference wasn't in firepower or training or even tactical superiority. It was in the ability to coordinate without announcing your intentions to every German soldier within radio intercept range. Private James "Jimmy" Sullivan from Chicago saw it firsthand. Sullivan had transferred to Easy Company in January 1945 as a replacement after the original radio operator had been killed. He'd been trained on the SCR-300 at Fort Benning, knew all the protocols, understood the importance of communication in coordinated infantry operations. What he didn't understand was why his new company barely used the radio he was carrying. First day, I'm setting up the radio, checking frequencies, ready to coordinate with battalion, Sullivan later recalled in a 1984 interview for the Veterans History Project. Lieutenant Weber walks over and says, "Pack that away. We won't need it unless we're calling for artillery or medical evacuation." I thought he was crazy. How are we supposed to coordinate without comms? Then he showed me the hand signals, spent 2 hours teaching me the basics, positioning me 100 yards out and running me through scenarios. By the end of the day, I understood. By the end of the week, I was a believer. That radio I'd trained so hard to operate, I used it maybe 4 times in 3 months. The hand signals? Every single day. The tactical advantages were obvious once you understood them. Radio transmissions could be intercepted, jammed, or triangulated. They required line of sight to antennas, clear frequencies, and functioning equipment. They had lag time, misunderstandings caused by static or accents, and the constant risk that someone would key the mic at the wrong moment and broadcast your position. Hand signals had none of those problems. They were instant, clear, and completely secure. A German signals intelligence unit could park a radio truck half a mile away and intercept every transmission an American company made. But they couldn't see a lieutenant's hand gestures through a hedgerow or across a forest clearing. The information moved from man to man, invisible to the enemy, faster than whispered words, and more reliable than static-filled radio chatter. The broader implications took longer to recognize. In February 1945, the Army Signal Corps conducted a study on communication effectiveness during the Battle of the Bulge. They analyzed after-action reports from 37 infantry companies across multiple divisions. The data showed something remarkable. Companies that had adopted visual communication protocols, whether Weber's specific system or variations developed independently, had 43% fewer casualties than companies relying primarily on radio coordination. The difference was statistically significant even when controlling for variables like terrain, enemy strength, and unit experience. The Signal Corps report concluded that visual communication methods represent a valuable supplement to radio protocols in contested environments and recommended that all infantry units receive training in standardized hand signal systems as part of basic tactical instruction. That recommendation became policy in March 1945. The infantry school at Fort Benning was ordered to develop a comprehensive visual communication curriculum. They brought in Weber and 3 other officers who'd developed similar systems in different theaters. For 2 weeks, they worked together in a classroom building in Georgia, comparing methods, debating the best signals for specific situations, and hammering out a standardized system that combined the best elements of each approach. Weber's signals formed the core. They were intuitive, visible at distance, and proven in combat. But the final system incorporated refinements from Lieutenant Thomas Chen, who developed visual protocols for jungle warfare in the Pacific, and Captain Robert Morrison, who'd created signals for urban combat during the fight through German cities. The resulting manual, FM 2160, Visual Signals for Infantry Operations, was published in May 1945, too late to impact the European War, but in time for units preparing for the invasion of Japan. The manual contained 47 distinct hand signals organized by category: movement signals, engagement signals, hazard warnings, status indicators, and command acknowledgments. Each signal was photographed from multiple angles, described in detail, and accompanied by tactical scenarios showing proper application. Weber wrote the introduction. It was 1 paragraph, characteristically brief. Radio communication is essential for modern warfare, but insufficient for all tactical situations. Visual signals provide a secure, reliable backup method that every soldier can learn and implement without specialized equipment. This manual standardizes those signals across the Army. The methods described herein have been validated in combat by infantry units in Europe and the Pacific. They work. Learn them. That was it. No grand pronouncements about the future of warfare or the theoretical implications of nonverbal communication, just a simple statement that the signals worked and soldiers should learn them. Classic Weber. The manual became required reading at every infantry training facility in the United States. Recruits entering basic training in the summer of 1945 learned hand signals alongside rifle marksmanship and map reading. By August, when the atomic bombs ended the war with Japan, visual communication was embedded in Army doctrine as thoroughly as any protocol developed by career theorists in Washington. The transition from rogue innovation to official procedure had taken less than a year. Weber's unauthorized field improvisation had become standard operating procedure for the entire infantry branch. It was one of the fastest doctrinal adoptions in Army history, and it happened because the results were too compelling to ignore. Men who used the signals survived. Men who didn't had higher casualties. The Army followed the data. Post-war analysis revealed just how significant the impact had been. A 1947 study by the Army War College examined infantry tactics evolution during World War II. The study identified three major tactical innovations that originated at the company level rather than from strategic planning. The first was the use of combined arms fire teams mixing rifles, automatic weapons, and grenades for close assault. The second was the adaptation of mortar fire for direct support of advancing infantry. The third was visual communication protocols for radio-denied environments. All three came from soldiers solving immediate problems with available resources. All three became doctrine, and all three saved thousands of lives by giving small unit leaders tools that worked in the chaos of actual combat. Weber's contribution was unique in one respect. The other innovations required some material resources, even if they were improvised uses of existing equipment. Fire teams needed the weapons, mortar adaptation required the mortars, but visual communication required nothing except training and discipline. Any infantry company could implement it immediately, without requisitioning new equipment or waiting for supply deliveries. That accessibility was part of why it spread so fast. A company commander in Belgium could learn about the system on Monday and have his entire unit trained by Friday. No paperwork, no logistics tail, no dependencies. Just teaching and practice. The human element mattered too. Weber's system worked because it was designed by someone who understood both the tactical problem and the capabilities of ordinary soldiers. He didn't create complex semaphore systems that required specialized training or perfect visibility. He created simple, bold gestures that a tired, scared private could see through fog and execute under fire. The signals were forgiving. If you didn't catch the exact finger position, you could still understand the general intent from the arm movement and context. That robustness made them practical. Theoretical communication systems designed in staff colleges often failed in the field because they demanded precision that combat conditions didn't allow. Weber's signals succeeded because they worked in the mud and chaos where soldiers actually fought. The legacy extended beyond World War II. When the Army revised infantry doctrine for Korea in 1950, visual communication protocols were expanded to include night signals using filtered flashlights and signals for mechanized infantry operating from vehicles. Vietnam brought further adaptations for jungle environments where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. The core gestures remained Weber's, but each conflict added refinements for specific tactical challenges. By the 1970s, visual communication was so embedded in infantry culture that soldiers learned it almost instinctively, the way they learned to keep their weapons clean and their heads down. It was just part of being infantry. Modern special operations forces took the concept even further. Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and Army Rangers developed elaborate visual communication systems for hostage rescue, direct action missions, and reconnaissance operations where absolute noise discipline was essential. Their signals were more complex than Weber's original system, adapted for operations where hand gestures might coordinate breaching charges, sniper fire, and helicopter insertions simultaneously. But the lineage was clear. Every special operations communication protocol traced back to the fundamental principle that a Montana lieutenant had proven on a Belgian ridge. Silence is a tactical advantage. Visual communication exploits that advantage. The method works. The international impact was significant too. After World War II, American infantry tactics became the gold standard that Allied nations studied and adapted. British, Canadian, Australian, and French armies all incorporated visual communication training into their infantry schools. NATO standardized a set of hand signals in 1952 to facilitate cooperation between Allied forces. Most of those signals came directly from FM 21 to 60, the manual Weber had helped write. By the 1960s, armies around the world were using variations of the system that had started with a trapper's son who didn't want his men dying because their radios gave them away. The dissemination happened through official channels, training exchanges, and the informal network of military professionals who recognize good ideas regardless of their origin. A French infantry captain observing American tactics in 1946 would notice the hand signals, ask about them, bring the concept back to his unit. A British officer at Fort Benning for advanced training would learn the system and implement it with his regiment in Germany. The spread was organic because the utility was obvious. By the time Weber died in 1989, his hand signal system had been taught to millions of soldiers across dozens of countries. It had been adapted for armored warfare, aviation operations, naval landing forces, and counterinsurgency operations. It had saved uncountable lives by enabling coordination without broadcast signatures. And almost none of the soldiers learning it knew where it came from. They knew it was doctrine. They knew it worked. They didn't know that it started with a lieutenant who'd learned to communicate silently while checking traplines in Montana and adapted that skill to war because the approved method was getting men killed. That anonymity would have pleased Weber. He never wanted credit. He wanted results. The fact that his system worked was satisfaction enough. There's a deeper lesson here about military innovation that's worth understanding. The armed forces are conservative institutions by necessity. They have to be. Doctrine exists because it codifies lessons learned in blood. Random experimentation in combat gets people killed. So the military is rightfully skeptical of unauthorized innovations and quick to enforce standardization. That conservatism is usually correct. Most battlefield improvisations don't work. Most field modifications create more problems than they solve. Most soldiers who think they've found a better way are wrong. But sometimes they're right. Sometimes a corporal or a lieutenant or a sergeant sees something that the generals and the staff planners missed. Sometimes practical experience in the field reveals solutions that theoretical study in staff colleges couldn't anticipate. The trick is identifying which innovations are genuine improvements and which are dangerous distractions. Weber's case illustrates the ideal path. He identified a real problem, radio communications creating vulnerabilities. He developed a solution based on demonstrated skills from his civilian life. He tested the solution in low-risk scenarios before implementing it in combat. He refined the system based on feedback from the soldiers using it. He documented results and responded to legitimate criticisms. When the system proved effective, he shared it freely and helped standardize it for broader use. That's textbook innovation. It's also rare. Most field improvisations skip steps. They jump straight from idea to implementation without testing. They resist feedback and standardization. They prioritize the inventor's ego over the method's effectiveness. Weber did none of that. He stayed focused on the problem, soldiers dying because of radio vulnerabilities, and the solution, a communication method that didn't rely on broadcasts. Everything else was secondary. The Army's response was equally important. Yes, Captain Harrison initially rejected the idea. Yes, there was resistance from officers who saw radio communication as non-negotiable. But when the data became clear, when casualty rates dropped and tactical effectiveness improved, the institution adapted. Division commanders like Robertson recognized value and directed implementation. Staff officers at the Signal Corps and Infantry School studied the results objectively and recommended adoption. The Army followed the evidence rather than protecting existing doctrine. That institutional flexibility doesn't get enough credit. For all its bureaucratic inertia and resistance to change, the military is remarkably good at adopting innovations that work. The process isn't fast, and it isn't always smooth, but effective methods eventually get incorporated. Weber's signals went from unauthorized field improvisation to official doctrine in under a year. That's actually impressive for an institution as large and cautious as the United States Army. The collaboration between field innovation and institutional adoption is where progress happens. Weber couldn't have spread his system across the entire Army by himself. He needed the institution to study it, validate it, standardize it, and teach it. But the institution wouldn't have developed the system without Weber's field experience and practical creativity. Both elements were essential. The soldier who saw the problem and created the solution. The institution that recognized the solution's value and scaled it for maximum impact. That partnership, when it works, is how militaries evolve. It's how tactical innovations become strategic advantages. It's how the lessons learned by one company on one ridge get transmitted to millions of soldiers across decades. That's the story of Lieutenant Carl Weber and his silence signal system. A Montana trapper's son who brought mountain skills to a European war and saved lives without broadcasting his intentions. A man who saw radios getting soldiers killed and developed an alternative that worked. An officer who violated protocol to preserve his men and turned his innovation into doctrine without asking for credit. He went to war. He adapted. He survived. He came home. He lived quietly. And now you know his name. Now you know what he did. Now you know that hand signals used by infantry soldiers around the world trace their lineage to a cold morning in the Ardennes, when one lieutenant decided that silence was better than static, and lives mattered more than regulations. The significance of what Weber accomplished extends beyond tactics and doctrine. It touches on something fundamental about problem-solving under pressure and the value of diverse backgrounds in specialized fields. Weber wasn't a career soldier. He didn't attend West Point or grow up dreaming of military service. He was a civilian who brought civilian skills to a military problem and adapted them in ways that trained professionals hadn't considered. That cross-pollination of ideas, that application of knowledge from one domain to challenges in another, that's where innovation lives. The Army needed Weber's Montana trapline experience as much as it needed West Point's tactical theory. Maybe more, because theory without practical application is just words on paper. Weber had practical skills honed through years of necessity, and he had the creativity to recognize how those skills could solve military problems. That pattern repeats throughout military history. Some of the most significant innovations come from soldiers who brought unconventional backgrounds to conventional challenges. The hedgerow cutters that helped tanks break through Norman bocage were designed by a sergeant who'd been a Tennessee farmer. The proximity fuse that revolutionized anti-aircraft fire came from civilian scientists who approached the problem differently than military engineers. The Norden bomb site, cryptanalysis breakthroughs at Bletchley Park, advances in trauma surgery, innovations in logistics and supply chain management. Almost all of them involved people who thought differently because they came from outside traditional military culture. Weber fits that tradition. He was an outsider who became essential because his outside perspective revealed solutions that insiders had missed. The lesson for modern military organizations, and really for any large institution, is clear. Diverse backgrounds aren't just good for optics or morale. They're operationally valuable. They bring different mental models, different problem-solving approaches, different categories of knowledge that can be applied in unexpected ways. When you staff an organization entirely with people who went through the same training, attended the same schools, and rose through the same career paths, you get consistency and predictability. But you also get blind spots. You get assumptions that everyone shares because everyone learned the same lessons. Weber's trapline experience wasn't in any infantry manual, so it wasn't a blind spot. It was a unique capability that solved a problem conventional training hadn't addressed. That's the value of unconventional backgrounds. They fill the gaps that standardized training creates. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for caring about these men and their innovations. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. There are more stories like this one, more men like Carl Weber who deserve to be remembered. Help me make sure they are. Until next time, remember that the men who changed the war weren't always the ones giving speeches or winning medals. Sometimes they were just solving problems with whatever they had, staying quiet about it and going home when it was over. Those are the men worth remembering. Those are the stories worth telling.